In 2013, one of the largest banks in the world finally dropped Jeffrey Epstein as a client. That same year, another one of the largest banks in the world picked him up. The first bank had flagged suspicious transactions for over a decade. The second knew his full criminal history before opening the account. Between them, they processed over $1.3 billion in Epstein-linked transactions. They paid over $600 million in settlements and fines. Neither was criminally charged. Before we trace how two of the most sophisticated financial institutions on Earth serviced a convicted sex offender for a combined 20 years, there is an email exchange you need to see. Between a senior JPMorgan executive and Jeffrey Epstein, it involves code names, Disney princess code names, for women, and it was sent from a JPMorgan corporate email account. That exchange, and the 1,200 emails behind it, comes later. First, the compliance system, because it worked. Someone flagged the crime, and someone else turned the flag off. In 1998, Jeffrey Epstein opened accounts at JPMorgan Chase. He would maintain more than 50 accounts at the bank over the next 15 years, holding at times over $200 million. From the beginning, Epstein was not a typical client. He operated through a web of shell companies and trusts. He made frequent large cash withdrawals, $40,000 to $80,000 per month. He wired money internationally to individuals and entities that didn't match the profile of a legitimate wealth management operation. And in 2002, 6 years before his criminal conviction, JPMorgan's own compliance team filed a suspicious activity report. A SAR is a confidential report that financial institutions are required to file with the U.S. Treasury Department when they detect activity that may indicate money laundering, fraud, or other financial crimes. It is the primary mechanism by which the banking system is supposed to catch criminal activity. JPMorgan's compliance officers caught it. They flagged it. They filed the report. The system worked, and nothing happened. The accounts stayed open. The transactions continued. The cash withdrawals kept flowing. And for the next 11 years, from 2002 to 2013, JPMorgan continued to process Epstein's money, while its own internal monitors kept raising alarms. Federal Judge Jed Rakoff, who oversaw the victim's class action lawsuit, wrote in his ruling that the 2002 SARs suggested the bank either suspected or knew outright that Epstein was operating a sex trafficking ring. But the compliance officers weren't the ones making the decision. The decision sat with senior management. And senior management, on at least 4 documented occasions over 5 years, overrode internal objections and kept Epstein as a client. The reason those overrides happened has a name. 4 overrides, 5 years, 11 years of open accounts after the first flag. The compliance system caught the crime in 2002. Senior management chose to ignore it. The question is why? And the answer is in 1,200 emails sent from a JPMorgan corporate account. Jess Staley joined JPMorgan in 1979. Over 30 years, he rose through the ranks to become head of the private bank and later CEO of the investment banking division. He was one of the most powerful executives in the building. He was also Jeffrey Epstein's closest contact inside the institution. Between 2008 and 2012, Staley exchanged approximately 1,200 emails with Epstein, all from his JPMorgan corporate email account. The emails were reviewed by U.S. financial regulators and later surfaced in the Virgin Islands lawsuit against the bank. The content of those emails tells you everything about why compliance was overridden. Staley described his friendship with Epstein as profound. He referred to Epstein as family. He wrote from Epstein's Island in November 2009, "So when all hell breaks loose and the world is crumbling, I will come here and be at peace. Presently, I'm in the hot tub with a glass of white wine. This is an amazing place, truly. Amazing. Next time, we're here together. I owe you much." In December 2009, Staley wrote, "I realized the danger in sending this email, but it was great to be able today to give you in New York City a long, heartfelt hug." Epstein replied the next day and included a photograph of a young woman. And then there were the code names. In July 2010, Staley emailed Epstein, "That was fun. Say hi to Snow White." Epstein responded, "What character would you like next?" Staley replied, "Beauty and the Beast." Epstein answered, "Well, one side is available." The USVI memorandum stated that Staley's JPMorgan email account contained messages about women who they referred to by the names of Disney princesses that Epstein procured for Staley, and discussions of sex with young women. Epstein also emailed Staley photos of young women in seductive poses. Court filings allege that Staley personally observed Epstein's abuse of at least one victim. Staley admitted under oath to having sexual relations with a member of Epstein's staff, and Epstein advised Staley on his salary negotiations at JPMorgan, the same bank whose compliance officers were trying to shut down Epstein's accounts. Now, here's the structural point that connects all of this to the financial story. This is not about one man's personal relationship with a sex offender. This is about what that relationship did to the compliance system. Staley championed Epstein's account internally. When compliance officers raised objections, the decision to override those objections sat with senior management, the same tier where Staley operated. The profitable client was shielded by a personal relationship at the executive level. The compliance system functioned. The hierarchy above it did not. And when Staley finally left JPMorgan in 2013, the same year the bank dropped Epstein, the DOJ's released files reveal something Staley denied under oath. His signature appears on Jeffrey Epstein's 2014 trust document and on a 2015 amendment, naming him as one of 3 trustees. Each trustee was entitled to an annual salary of $250,000. In court, Staley testified that he had declined the role. The documents say otherwise. While Staley shielded Epstein inside JPMorgan, the bank's accounts processed what investigators would later total at over $1 billion in suspicious transactions. Cash withdrawals, wire transfers to young women, payments to co-conspirators, payments to recruiters. And when JPMorgan finally dropped Epstein in 2013, after 15 years, the system didn't shut him out. It handed him off. In 2013, the same year JPMorgan dropped Epstein, Deutsche Bank opened his accounts. The bank's own CEO, Christian Sowing, would later admit onboarding Epstein in 2013 was a critical mistake and should never have happened. But it did happen. And here's what makes the Deutsche Bank chapter structurally worse than JPMorgan's. JPMorgan took Epstein on in 1998 and before his conviction. You can argue, as the bank has, that early warning signs were ambiguous. Deutsche Bank took him on in 2013, 5 years after his guilty plea, 5 years after he registered as a sex offender, and in the immediate aftermath of JPMorgan cutting ties specifically because of compliance concerns. Deutsche Bank knew everything, and they opened the accounts anyway. The New York State Department of Financial Services, the regulator that would later fine the bank $150 million, found that the decision to onboard Epstein was made despite publicly available information concerning the circumstances surrounding Mr. Epstein's earlier criminal misconduct. A reputational risk committee inside the bank did impose conditions on the accounts. Those conditions, which, if followed, might have caught the suspicious activity that followed, were never transmitted to the majority of the account relationship team. A compliance officer misinterpreted them in a way that resulted in, as the regulator put it, very little actual change in how the monitoring of the accounts occurred. For the next 5 years, Deutsche Bank processed the following: payments to individuals publicly alleged to be Epstein's co-conspirators in sexually abusing young women, settlement payments totaling over $7 million, legal fees totaling over $6 million for what appeared to be the expenses of Epstein and his co-conspirators, payments to Russian models, payments for women's school tuition, hotel expenses, and rent, payments directly to numerous women with Eastern European surnames, and over $800,000 in suspicious cash withdrawals across approximately 4 years. The regulator's conclusion: very few problematic transactions were ever questioned, and even when they were usually cleared without satisfactory explanation. In 2020, the New York State Department of Financial Services fined Deutsche Bank $150 million. It was the first enforcement action by any regulator against a financial institution for dealings with Jeffrey Epstein. In 2023, Deutsche Bank paid an additional $75 million to settle a victim's class action lawsuit, and a separate shareholder lawsuit resulted in a $26.25 million settlement for lax oversight. The plaintiff's lawyers summarized the relationship in a single sentence: Deutsche Bank picked up exactly where JPMorgan left off and became the bank that Epstein needed to fund his sexual abuse and sex trafficking operation. Now you've seen both banks. You've seen the flags, the overrides, the handoff, the transactions. But the most damning document in this entire story is the one JPMorgan filed after Epstein was already dead. A single suspicious activity report covering 16 years of transactions, 4,700 transfers, over $1.1 billion, filed 1 month after it was too late to stop anything. That report, and what it reveals about who else was in the system, comes next. On September 26, 2019, 1 month after Jeffrey Epstein died in federal custody, JPMorgan Chase filed a suspicious activity report with the U.S. Treasury Department. The report covered transactions from October 2003 through July 2019. It flagged approximately 4,700 transactions. The total value, over $1.1 billion. 1 month after the client was dead, the bank reported 16 years of suspicious activity. Let that structure sit with you. The Bank Secrecy Act requires institutions to file SARs in a timely manner when they detect activity that may involve money laundering, fraud, or other crimes. JPMorgan had filed some SARs during Epstein's time as a client. The 2002 filing is on record. But the comprehensive report, the one covering the full scope of the activity, came after death, not during life. Senator Ron Wyden's assessment: Bank executives tuned out compliance officers who were alarmed by Epstein's transactions, seemingly withheld evidence of potential money laundering, and coached Epstein on how to obscure suspiciously large cash withdrawals. This goes beyond a total compliance breakdown. Coached, not ignored. Coached. According to Wyden's investigation, JPMorgan didn't just fail to report Epstein. The bank allegedly helped him structure his withdrawals to avoid triggering automated flags. Now, here is what the 2019 SAR revealed. The report identified transactions with Leon Black, his wife, and a Black family partnership. We covered the $170 million in Episode 3. It identified transactions with Glenn Dubin, a hedge fund manager. Epstein had brokered the sale of Dubin's hedge fund to JPMorgan and received a $15 million fee. Epstein previously dated Dubin's wife and was godfather to the Dubin's children. It identified transactions with Alan Dershowitz. It identified transactions involving trusts controlled by Leslie Wexner. We covered the $1.3 billion in trust stock sales in Episode 2. And it identified 2 accounts linked to Russian banks, Alpha Bank and Sberbank. The report also revealed the operational mechanics of the trafficking infrastructure. At least 20 victims of Epstein were paid more than $1 million collectively through JPMorgan accounts between 2003 and 2013. Epstein withdrew more than $775,000 in cash during that period. His JPMorgan accounts wired nearly $1.5 million to known recruiters, individuals identified by prosecutors as part of the trafficking operation. The bank processed payments to Ghislaine Maxwell. It processed payments to women with Eastern European surnames. When questioned, Epstein told the bank these payments were for tuition or rent. The bank accepted the explanation and continued processing. And here's the number that matters most for understanding the institutional math. Epstein's accounts at JPMorgan were brimming with more than $200 million. He generated substantial revenue for the bank. He helped the bank land other high net worth clients, including, according to reporting, Google co-founder Sergey Brin. That is the equation. On one side, compliance officers filing SARs, raising flags, objecting internally. On the other side, hundreds of millions in deposits, revenue generation, client referrals, and a senior executive personally invested in the relationship. The revenue won, every time. If you're starting to see how the banking system is designed to protect revenue over compliance, this is what Empire of Secrets investigates, every episode. The mechanisms, the architecture, the money trails that institutions hoped no one would follow. Subscribe now, because Episode 5 maps the offshore machine that moved Epstein's money across borders. That story drops soon. Let me now put the full financial picture of both institutions on one screen. JPMorgan Chase. Client relationship, 1998 to 2013, 15 years. First SAR filed, 2002. Senior management overrides, at least 4 over 5 years. Accounts held over $200 million. Suspicious transactions flagged retroactively, 4,700, totaling $1.1 billion. Victim settlement, $290 million. U.S. fee, I settlement, $75 million. Total, $365 million. Criminal charges, 0. Deutsche Bank. Client relationship, 2013 to 2018. 5 years. Took Epstein on with full knowledge of criminal history. Reputational risk conditions imposed but never transmitted to account team. Processed payments to co-conspirators, Russian models, women with Eastern European surnames, settlement payments, legal fees, suspicious cash. NYDFS fine, $150 million. First enforcement action by any. Regulator. Victim settlement, $75 million. Shareholder settlement, $26.25 million. Total, $251.25 million. Criminal charges, 0. Combined across both institutions, 20 years of continuous banking service to a convicted sex offender. Over $1.3 billion in flagged transactions. Over $616 million in settlements and fines. The largest sex trafficking financial settlements in history. Criminal charges against either institution, 0. Now, here is the detail that transforms this from a story about 2 banks into a story about the system. Deutsche Bank did not discover Epstein independently. Epstein came to Deutsche Bank specifically because JPMorgan dropped him. The lawsuit states Deutsche Bank picked up exactly where JPMorgan left off. There was no gap, no cooling off period, no industry-wide blacklist, no regulator warning other institutions. When JPMorgan exited the relationship in 2013, the compliance concerns that triggered that exit were not shared with the banking system at large. The SARs filed with the Treasury Department are confidential. They are not distributed to other banks. The criminal conviction was public, but the specific nature of Epstein's banking activity, the cash withdrawals, the payments to women, the wire transfers to recruiters, remained inside JPMorgan's files. So Deutsche Bank made its own decision: onboard a convicted sex offender, impose conditions, fail to enforce those conditions, and process 5 more years of the same transactions that JPMorgan had processed for 15. The system didn't fail twice. It was designed to fail this way. The confidentiality of SARs, the absence of an interbank warning mechanism, the separation between compliance filing and compliance enforcement, all of it allowed the same client to move from one institution to the next without interruption. That is the architecture of institutional enabling. Not conspiracy, not collusion, structure. This episode is called Inside the Banks That Looked Away. But looking away implies a choice. What the evidence shows is something more structural than a choice. The Bank Secrecy Act, the primary federal law governing anti-money laundering compliance, requires financial institutions to file suspicious activity reports when they detect transactions that may involve criminal activity. The law has been in effect since 1970. It has been amended and strengthened multiple times since then. But here is the gap at the center of the law. Filing a SAR does not require the institution to close the account. It does not require the institution to stop processing the transactions. It does not trigger an automatic investigation by law enforcement. A SAR is a notification, not an enforcement mechanism. That means a bank can file a SAR in 2002, documenting suspicious activity consistent with sex trafficking, and continue servicing the client for 11 more years because the law requires the filing. It does not require the action. And because SARs are confidential, no other institution receives the warning. When JPMorgan dropped Epstein, Deutsche Bank had no access to the specific compliance concerns that triggered the exit. They saw the public conviction. They did not see the 1,200 emails, the 4 overrides, the cash withdrawal patterns, or the payments to recruiters. The system is designed to detect. It is not designed to prevent. And the gap between detection and prevention is where 20 years of Epstein's banking activity lived. Now, the settlements. $616 million sounds enormous, and for the victims who received compensation, it represents something meaningful. But for JPMorgan Chase, a bank with annual revenues exceeding $150 billion, $365 million is a rounding error. It is approximately 1 day's revenue. It is absorbed, written off, and forgotten within a single quarterly earnings report. The victim's attorney, David Boies, summarized it. A sex trafficking ring cannot operate without a bank. And Senator Wyden posed the structural question directly. There's got to be more accountability from the top on down. Epstein was not an anonymous customer with a few $1,000s in his checking account. He was a high-value, high-profile client of white-glove private banks and a known criminal. If the penalty for enabling trafficking is a civil settlement absorbed as a cost of business, and the compliance system files reports without requiring action, then the system is not designed to stop what happened. It is designed to document it after the fact. That is the lesson of this episode. The banks didn't fail. They functioned exactly as the system allowed them to. Here's what we now know. JPMorgan Chase serviced Jeffrey Epstein for 15 years. Its compliance system flagged suspicious activity as early as 2002. Senior management overrode those flags at least 4 times. A senior executive exchanged 1,200 emails with Epstein, including code names for women, photos of young women, and declarations of profound friendship. The bank processed over $1 billion in suspicious transactions. It paid $365 million in settlements. It was never criminally charged. Deutsche Bank picked Epstein up the same year JPMorgan dropped him. It knew his full criminal history. It imposed compliance conditions and failed to enforce them. For 5 years, it processed payments to co-conspirators, Russian models, women with Eastern European surnames, and over $7 million in settlement payments. It paid $251 million in fines and settlements. It was never criminally charged. Between them, 20 years. Over $1.3 billion in flagged transactions. Over $600 million in penalties. 0 criminal charges. The compliance system detected the crime. The hierarchy above it chose revenue. And when one bank finally acted, the system rotated the client to the next institution with no warning, no blacklist, and no enforcement. The banks didn't look away. They looked directly at the evidence and calculated that the cost of compliance was higher than the cost of complicity. And the money that moved through these institutions, the wire transfers, the cash withdrawals, the payments to recruiters and victims, didn't originate at the banks. It originated in the offshore structures that Epstein built across the Caribbean and beyond. That's where episode 5 goes. Inside the shell companies, the Virgin Islands tax entities, and the offshore architecture that made the money untraceable before it ever reached a bank. Episode 5. The Epstein Files, the offshore machine behind the money.